Well, evening, ladies and lads. Welcome to the next episode of the Rouseabout podcast. Tonight, we were going to be looking at sort of a general analysis of Australian foreign policy with regards to the fall of Singapore in 1942. So, for those that don't know anything about the event, to briefly summarise Australian foreign policy up to that point, it always consisted essentially of being completely reliant on the British Navy for the defence of Australia, and then in return, this sort of general understanding that Australia would send its military overseas to support Britain in whatever conflicts it had in return for this sort of guarantee of protection. And up until this point, we'd always seen the British Navy and their sort of colonial forces as essentially this unstoppable force, at least within East Asia and the Pacific, and as something able to defend us from anyone in the region. Now, obviously, Australia at the time having a population of about 6 million, we were very aware of the fact that you had nations like China, like Japan, that outnumbered us a million to one, which were at the time all facing shortages of resources. Japan in particular, for decades prior to this event, had been acutely aware of their shortage of resources in their homeland, which had led to sort of expansionist foreign policies in places like Manchuria, trying to colonize relatively empty land for resources, meanwhile being a massive continent with only 6 million people in a relatively empty part of the world. We'd always felt that we needed some large foreign power to defend us on the off chance that they ever decided to come south. At the time, during the 40s and for a while beforehand, the port of Singapore on the Straits of Malacca had always been the British main centre of power in the region. Having a deep water port in the Straits of Malacca, which is arguably the most important sea lane in the world, with the possible exception of the Suez Canal. It was a perfect location from which to sort of base their navy and control the whole region. And being an island off the coast was, again, relatively easy to fortify. And the island had long served as the sort of main base for the British in the area. So when the war first broke out, Australia in the old tradition sent most of their forces overseas, either initially bound for Europe and then after the evacuation of Dunkirk, rerouted most of them to North Africa. But the idea being to defend Britain and whatever endeavours they were going through, with the understanding that the British based out of Singapore would be defending us. However, we did send, and I want to say about 40,000, I can get the number up here, of our own men into Singapore to join the British garrison there, although they were all placed under the command of British senior officers led by Lieutenant General Percival. At the time, the Japanese were still, for the most part, occupied in China and weren't really seen as a primary threat, as opposed to the blitzkrieg that was happening at the time in Europe, and then later Rommel and the Italians in North Africa. But then suddenly, with the fall of France, Germany essentially gifted French Indochina to the Japanese, meaning that they suddenly were around 3,000 k's closer almost overnight. And within a few weeks of this, Japan also made an agreement with the Kingdom of Thailand, which gave them free military access through the nation, meaning there's suddenly, within a matter of weeks, they went from being thousands of kilometres away in northern and central China to being only a few hundred k's away at the northern tip of the British colony of Malaya. The Japanese army of the time in Southeast Asia was fairly small, only consisting of around 20,000 troops led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. However, these were considered some of the best within the Japanese army, and quickly advanced into Malaya. The British force, on the other hand, was much larger at around 80,000, including the Australian and as well as some Indian garrisons. However, the leadership simply just did not see it as important. Percival, who they sent out, was largely a nepotism hire for the British Army. It came from a wealthy family, etc., and thus was expected to be promoted to a senior position. Yet no one important actually wanted him doing anything of real serious nature for their national security, hence why I've been posted off to the Pacific, which for the British was sort of a who cares in comparison to somewhere like France, their immediate backdoor. And essentially every time there was any major conflict, he just ordered these constant retreats, falling back slowly through Malaya over the course of about 3 weeks without ever seriously engaging the Japanese. At the time too, they were largely taken by surprise in that many of these garrisons here had never fought an Asian power before. Neither the British or the Australians had gone to war with an Asian nation in the last 100 years or so, with the exception of the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars, both of which were very easy Western victories over these technologically underdeveloped and badly led Chinese armies, and thus there was an attitude that this would sort of be a walkover, and the minute we fire off a few warning shots, they'll run screaming. So yeah, the minute they encountered any sort of real resistance, they sort of fell back, unsure what to do. At the same time, Singapore had always been intended first and foremost as a naval and more recently air force base, as opposed to an army base. It was, after all, an island off the coast, and any defense of it would be based around primarily the Navy and Air Force, supported by small local garrisons of the infantry. However, right before and even during the campaign, the British were continuing to pull out their Navy and almost all their Air Force to bring them back towards the home islands to defend Britain during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, meaning that towards the end of the campaign, there are only about 30 aircraft in all, or military aircraft, that is, in all of Singapore. And so although the Allies outnumbered the Japanese almost 4-1, they lacked the stable supply lines, but also obviously having vast aerial superiority was a massive morale boost for the Japanese. It's when you're having bombs, etc., rain down on you from above, from this, what was in your mind as backward little Asian jungle people. They were taken aback and essentially retreated all their forces towards this island fortress in Singapore. From there, the Japanese massed most of their forces in Johor, which is the southernmost principality of the Malay Peninsula, which, whilst nominally part of the colony, was still largely ruled by local leadership in the form of the Sultan of Johor, who happened to be a close friend of General Percival. So when Yamashita then based his sort of whole command post and lookout out of the Sultan of Johor's palace, which overlooked sort of the straits and onto the island of Singapore, the British knew he was there watching them, and yet refused to bomb him, precisely because Percival didn't want to bomb his good friend's palace and damage the building. The Japanese then spent a week every night driving large convoys of trucks with the lights on towards the west of Johor, opposite the west of the island of Singapore, and then later on in the night driving them back with the lights off, to sort of create this idea that they were amassing in the west. And thus Percival put all his British troops in the west of Singapore, whilst leaving only a small garrison of Australians guarding the beaches in the east. So when the Japanese then attacked in the east, they immediately gained a beachhead. But at this point, Singapore itself was still a large city with numerous artillery guns and fortifications and a garrison that outnumbered them 4-1. They then just immediately surrendered the city and the entire garrison without a fight, because they didn't like the undignified idea of street fighting and urban warfare. And thus, overnight, essentially the entire Pacific Army, Navy, etc., of the British, and by extension Australia, were all sold out just because they couldn't be bothered.
Now, what do you mean by the undignified nature of street fighting?
There's traditional European notions of sort of honourable warfare. Men in nice, neat lines in open field battles, whereas street warfare was firstly much more brutal, hand-to-hand fighting and less pleasant, but also from a general's point of view, much more difficult to coordinate, much more risk of civilians getting harmed, of guerrilla fighting, or of damage to people and property, etc. And Percival didn't like the idea, and whilst normally anyone in this situation would have significant oversight from the government, in this sense the government back in London just couldn't care less. So they just told him, surrender, why not? It's one less thing for us to think about, one less thing for us to worry about, so that we can focus purely on what to them was the far, far more important issue of an impending German invasion of Britain. But meanwhile, to Australia, Singapore was the gateway to Australia. This is, our entire defence in the Pacific. This was a matter of life and death. But because they'd been placed under this British leadership who just couldn't care less, they'd had their entire garrison surrendered overnight without a fight.
It looked a bit too much like trench warfare.
This with the collapse of the Netherlands, the Dutch colony of Indonesia largely collapsed, and the Japanese overnight, and we were left with literally a couple hundred of the conscript militias defending New Guinea as the sole defence against this 20,000 strong army of the best Japanese troops coming towards Australia, before finally they were able to pull out some units from North Africa, the professional army, and bring them into New Guinea. But even this was a massive political fight with the British High Command attempting to ban Australians from leaving North Africa to come home to defend Australia. And it was, only when they sort of threatened mass mutinies and there were large-scale desertions, they finally conceded and let 4 battalions go home.
Incredible.
That's a brief summary of the event itself. But in terms of the sort of fallback from this, Menzies, who had been Prime Minister at the start of the war, was always known for being a major Anglophile. He, in his head, was a citizen of the Empire first and an Australian second. And he'd been very quick at the onset of the war to throw his full support behind Britain and to send basically our entire army overseas. And while it's still was only ever rumours at the time, at the time there was a general belief that he hoped that by getting senior enough in Australian politics, he could eventually work his way up to the much more rewarding goal of going into British politics, which this, of course, being back when an Australian citizen was legally a citizen of the British Empire. And by ingratiating himself to the British through using Australia to defend them, he could one day get further up in the politics there. But after this event, we just sort of see this general disillusionment within the Australian population of this idea that, well, firstly, the British can care less about us, but secondly, that even if they could, that they are able to defend us. And under the next Prime Minister, John Curtin, who took over in 1952, we then see Australia from this point on more or less abandoning the outward notion that they are a part of the empire. They still sort of make, superficial gestures. We still have the flag. We still sing God Save the Queen. But in terms of their foreign policy from that point on, they abandoned this policy of just doing what Britain wants them to. And
it became apparent
start courting much
we
closer
needed to defend ourselves.
And firstly start courting much closer relations with the Americans, who became our primary ally from 1942 through till today. But just, more generally, it created this real sense that we're an independent nation and we're allies with people because they can help us rather than because it's, our honourable duty to defend the empire. Which, a large part of it too was just we never really had any genuine existential threat to Australia before. We'd always had the luxury of being able to make foreign policy decisions based off what was ethical or what was our duties, as opposed to just what'll keep us alive. And this was just a real wake up call that these big Asian countries to the north can invade us and will, given the chance.
And no one is coming to save you.
And and no one cares enough to save you unless you force them to. Well, there's the spiel, but
it's quite funny and coincidental because it almost falls within about the same time frame as the fall of the Philippines, and under extremely similar circumstances, although much greater numbers in the Philippines, like Japanese air superiority with an unprepared force being the US, and that really the MacArthur's withdrawal to Australia probably cemented that US relationship even closer, I would imagine.
And I suppose the Americans, in a sense, they were in a similar spot in that they'd always been, making foreign policy decisions off, very, abstract notions of, we're the land of the free and we only need to look inwards. This is our manifest destiny. With things like the Monroe Doctrine, and this was, again, for them, a wake-up call that outside forces can and will attack you unless you really engage with the outside world in a meaningful way. And so, in a sense, they were forced to start interacting with us as much as we were forced to start interacting with them.
It could be said that before, say, the Americans, before World War II, we couldn't join up with them, and the British, after 1947, with the independence of India, weren't really strong enough to be a force in our region.
No, and we see going forward after that, obviously, in the late 50s, 1954, they did fight a successful war in Malaya against the communist guerrillas, but for the most part, over the 20 years following, they gradually lost sort of whatever influence they had in the region. But so, it was an inevitable process. But at the same time, this was sort of the event that just kickstarted the sort of beginning of the decline. And in a sense, too, like we weren't the only ones relying on Singapore. Like the Indians and Burma, Indonesia, etc., everyone in the region had kind of been relying on the British as or the Pax Britannica, if you will, to defend them. And just as much as it sort of disillusioned us, it also disillusioned the Indians and everyone else in the region to this idea that the British cared about them or could defend them if they wanted to.
I have a question. Was Singapore retaken, or was it still in Japanese hands in 45 when they surrendered?
Supposedly in late September, as of 45, the Allies were sort of wrapping up their campaign in Borneo and the surrounding islands. And there was a plan already being devised and sort of with the logistics being prepared, landing craft put together, etc., for a naval invasion of Singapore. Also, supposedly, the local sort of resistance groups were planning a large uprising, similar to what happened in places like Warsaw at the time. Although that said, it's unclear to what extent both of those are sort of people, retrospectively saying, "Oh yeah, we had them on the ropes. Any minute we would have taken them," to sort of save embarrassment. But yeah, supposedly there were plans to retake it within the next few weeks, as of when the bomb was dropped. But no, it was still in Japanese hands. And the disaster too, it wasn't purely just national security thing too, in that the Allies sort of thought, we just don't want to waste any casualties in Singapore because it's just unimportant to us. Why make British forces die over this, thinking that surrender was an alternative to dying, when in reality the Japanese prisoner of war system, which was largely based out of major prisons such as Changi on Singapore, as well as many more of the prisoners being taken into Southeast Asia for work on sort of Japanese infrastructure projects such as the Thailand-Burma Railway, was absolutely brutal and was shown to be brutal throughout the sort of several weeks of the campaign before the surrender. I can't remember the name of the battle off my head, but in the first few days of the Battle of Malaya, that Japanese captured 430 something prisoners and just had most of them burnt alive, including most of those being wounded. So yeah, it was already very clear to anyone bothering to look that surrender was not a pleasant option. But yeah, again, it was just these sort of rush decisions and lack of foresight. And between a quarter and a third of those taken prisoner ended up dying before 1945 in captivity. And yeah, we're just generally kept under brutal conditions, tropical diseases running rampant in all the camps, mass starvation, malnutrition, harsh punishments, etc. And so, yeah, far more died in captivity as a result of that surrender than any estimate would put, the likely casualties of sort of, defending to the death in Singapore.
Speaking of Changi, the chapel constructed there by Australian POWs is now it's been reconstructed, and it's got its home in Duntroon, where the Royal Military College is. And I believe the padre that ran the chapel in Singapore retired as the highest ranked padre within the Australian Defence Force ever, as far as I'm aware.
Actually, no, I have heard of that chapel, and was discussing it the other day in the context that it's supposedly during all the, I don't know how much you know about sort of the Vatican II reforms in the Catholic Church, but when almost all churches in the country were redesigned to sort of fit more kind of modernist ideals for the church, no one wanted to change that particular chapel because it was sort of half a chapel, half a museum, and it had been built by the prisoners of war, and so it was the only chapel in Australia to still maintain things like altar rails through the 60s and 70s.
It's really small. Actually, it's more of a hut. It's quite outdoors. I think it's open on all sides. It's got some small walls, but it's open air. It's actually quite a picturesque little building, I reckon.
But yeah, I suppose the question for the whole topic sort of going forward is then, to what extent are we still in the same situation now? I mean, Australia in the years following the immediate fallout of the war, we saw things like the Fortress Australia program and Populate or Perish, where sort of making massive efforts to try and make ourselves self-reliant for our defence, under the understanding that we had to be. And so, through that, trying to acquire nukes unsuccessfully, with both the British and Americans promising to give us nuclear weapons if we let them test them on Australian soil, and then the British ultimately going back on their word. And then the Populate or Perish scheme, which did massively increase Australia's population from about 8 million through to 20 million, sort of over a few short decades.
Well, on this topic, I was going to ask, how does the transition work between, this period and, seeing Australia's involvement, even military training with Indonesia, and, it looks from the outside like a complete 180.
Well, there is probably a large expansion of Australian forces assisting and on exchange with Indochina and like Pacific neighbours. They send army cadets here, or their officer cadets, and we send no officer cadets to them because our institution is obviously the best. However, we do send fully trained officers on exchange program to their military academies.
And yeah, I mean, a lot of that does sort of come out of that same mentality of, you know, not necessarily being self-reliant for defense, but at least sort of diversifying out of our defense in that we're no longer reliant on one ally, but rather working with various nations in the region to sort of secure mutual defense. But that said, as modern technologies such as aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, etc., come to more and more dominate international war, it's very much returning to that old paradigm of when battleships dominated the world, where small nations like us do need to ally with large nations such as, in this case, America, for our own defense. So we see now in a way very similar situation now with Australia going into places such as Afghanistan, nominally to out of an altruistic desire to secure peace, but in practice primarily just to ingratiate ourselves to the Americans to secure things like the ANZUS Treaty, which in return supposedly guarantees American protection from these much larger nations in our own immediate area, which realistically we could never do anything against on our own.
Was the outcome of the fall of Singapore at all a shock to anyone else apart from Australia? Did that have any sort of change in perception of Britain in the wider scale?
Oh, certainly. I mean, like I was saying earlier, just the immediate region, all these areas like India, Indonesia, etc., that all kind of relied on the Pax Britannica in the region. It was suddenly they were no longer this invincible force that we can all rely on in exchange for sort of doing what they say. But yeah, more generally, it was well, I mean, we'd already seen Asian powers defeating Europeans in sort of conflicts beforehand, such as the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. But this was the preeminent European power in their preeminent colonial base being very easily defeated by a non-European nation, and was in a sense a very clear sign the writing was on the wall for the whole European colonial world order, and the world is moving towards a much more unipolar system.
Is there
in the end we didn't. It ultimately ended with a very kind of bipolar system with just the USSR and America running the show in the fallout, as kind of all the other great powers like France, Britain, Japan, etc., all sort of destroyed themselves through the war. But yeah, at the time, that was very much the attitude, was that sort of the old order is clearly gone.
Could you draw a parallel with another empire in history and a sort of watershed moment which saw a seemingly perfect face now bear a mark, kind of show its mortality?
I mean, the Russo-Japanese War, which I mentioned, is, I suppose, was a good example. That was the first time that a European power had sort of lost total war to a non-European power in sort of hundreds of years at the time. That said, I suppose, particularly for the British, there was a degree of that they did kind of look down on the Russians as not really European, but at the same time, it was still they were still using all the same basic bureaucratic systems and technological systems, etc. So, but yeah, the significance, I think, was more not so much that they were beaten at their best, so much as that what was supposed to be their best, they just couldn't care enough to defend. Like they didn't have the resources or the interest to defend this, as opposed to that they couldn't. Which, I mean, obviously everyone would have known, this isn't Britain at its height. This is Britain while fighting a major war, but it was just sort of this general attitude of, we don't care, it's only the colonies, that's expendable, which kind of, opened everyone's eyes in the region and caused them all to, if they don't think of us as them, then why should we think of ourselves as part of Britain?
Do you think that maybe the subsequent taking of colony after colony of the British Empire probably led to the eventual downfall of it? Post-war, as with India in 1947, we see independence movement over and over again in a lot of British colonies. I mean,
India is a slightly different situation, that it was never actually occupied, but certainly in places like Malaysia, Singapore, etc., the occupation sort of destroyed all the local British leadership. But by extension, that then meant that sort of what little local leadership, if anything, got more power just sort of through the vacuum that was left, and in creating local resistance movements, guerrilla forces to fight the Japanese, which the British would have been completely supportive of. It then meant that when they came back in 1945, there was now a local leadership and proper local military forces and people with military experience and an experience of resisting large empires that could then lead revolts against them. Aside from just the purely cultural impact, in India, in a sense, was probably much more like Australia there in that they just felt used. Britain will take our troops, sort of send them off to fight in their wars, whilst not actually caring enough to defend us, and then just surrender us when it just becomes too much effort, and then kind of expecting us to continue to defend them, and by putting that little bit more strain on the system, it just kind of showed that it was all one-sided.
Yeah, interesting. And considering a lot of I would say the pushback from Allied forces in the Pacific, particularly I would say the smaller nations, as most people would know, the US really focused on the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, and to some extent the US Army in New Guinea. But a lot of those smaller nations, particularly Indonesian islands, Borneo, etc., often taken on by Australians and occasionally Australian special forces, or an early version of that.
And in a sense, you could. I mean, we'd already intervened in New Guinea in 1914, but for the most part, this was sort of our first time really taking an active sort of leadership role in our own region. Like, up until this point, we'd always just been there as a kind of a lackey of the British, whereas we now see ourselves taking on this sort of independent foreign policy in Indonesia, in New Guinea, and us being the local great power that was, or middle power, I suppose, that was sort of there defending them as Australia, as opposed to as the empire.
Yeah, I think that sort of set the conditions for our response to the Malaya emergency, and then probably subsequently Vietnam as well. Obviously, Vietnam, the British completely avoiding.
Yeah, and I feel there's still largely a popular myth in Australia that which we kind of like to perpetuate, because Vietnam ended up being ultimately a defeat. Like, we like to blame it all on them. This was just America dragging us into their colonial war, when in reality it was actually quite the other way, with us being very heavily encouraging them to get as involved in Southeast Asia as possible, sort of on our behalf.
Do you think there's a parallel there?
Very aware of this whole domino theory.
Do you think there's a parallel between America seeing defeat in Vietnam and Britain, Singapore, mainly in terms of losing face?
I mean, certainly a parallel. I wouldn't say it had quite the same consequences in that, no, people never really expected the same thing of the Americans as they did the British. Like, for the British, it was, you are our empire, you are our citizens, our subjects, and we are obligated to protect you. Whereas with America, it was, whilst so you can certainly talk about the American empire, there was never an empire on the map. It was always just, we have a mutually beneficial alliance, and now the alliance has stopped being mutually beneficial, we're going to get out of here. But there was never quite the same sense of betrayal. We were always very aware that we were using an alliance with America for our own personal gain, and
right. I meant less in terms of the alliance. I meant more in terms of simply
it was a similar
perception
effect
of America.
in terms of them losing face. That said, the Vietnam War was in a sense a success in that after the successful rebellion in Algeria in the late 50s against the French Indochina sort of thought, oh, if they can do it, we can do it too, and they rose up against the French. And then the Americans sort of did it was this domino effect, and the Americans wanted to stop this, then intervened. And although Vietnam ultimately won, in the process they had every major city completely leveled to the ground. They had almost 20 years of near constant fighting internally and externally, massive casualties, millions dead, and it kind of in that sense achieved the desired result, in that other countries looking on, even if they thought it was possible, that wasn't something you wanted to go through. It just wasn't worth it. And so in terms of discouraging future copycat revolutions. It actually worked quite effectively, which that was always very much the goal for us and the Americans. It was defending South Vietnam was ultimately just a tool to achieve that main goal of stopping future revolutions in other countries.
And I suppose as for Asia, it worked really.
Yeah, I mean, you had the Khmer Rouge and Lao, but that was it really. You never saw it sort of spreading further into Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, etc.
Do you have any follow-up recommended reading on Fall of Singapore or the Malay campaign before it?
In terms of specific books, nothing particularly comes to mind. One thing I was flicking through just earlier today, which might be interesting, is it's called the Wavell Report, which I've been looking at this mostly from an Australian perspective, but this Arthur Wavell was sort of the head of British foreign policy in Asia, or one of the heads of the office there, who wrote a report sort of after Singapore, trying to sort of explain his what went wrong. And he essentially tried to, while he did sort of acknowledge several failures, in a large part tried to blame it all on the Australians and on the colonial troops. And it's kind of, quite reminiscent, I suppose, of the whole Break of Morant affair, just, passing it all off as unruly colonial troops that, kept running away and wouldn't obey orders. And, they couldn't fight because they were all just, too busy, drinking and looting, etc., which there was very little on the ground evidence to support any of these claims, but it was this same sort of British attitude of just, when anything goes wrong, blame the colonials.
I do have.
Whilst in the meantime, obviously, the popular myth for everyone else was to sort of blame it all on the British. Well, I'm sure there were Australians that did things wrong leading to it. But both sides sort of had this very clear popular myth, which, in a sense, the popular myth is almost more important than the actual events, in that that's what people kind of base their decisions off going forward. And both groups totally blamed the other for the failure.
I've got one book recommendation. It's not Singapore specific, but it is Southeast Asia specific, and British and colonial forces. It's called Special Operation Southeast Asia, 1942 to 1945, by David Miller. And it just sort of gives a general detail of special operations undertaken by British and colonial forces within the region. It's based off family records and off of military records as well. So after action analysis and things like that. It's very analytical to read.
You mean like interviews from family about stories that were shared with them?
Yeah, somewhat, but it also looks at official report from the military at the time. So it's got a bit of jargon in it, but it's pretty interesting. It's a sort of a good insight into the small teams that were really causing havoc to the Japanese at the time.
Yeah, nice.
Rightio. Give it. Sorry, could you just repeat the name for the listeners?
So it's by David Miller, and it's called Special Operation Southeast Asia, 1942 to 1945. I think it's part of a series.
Alrighty. Well, unless anyone has some new turn take on this, I say we wrap it up.
Yeah. No, I'm happy with that.
Yep.
No need to
happy to
stretch it
happy
out.
to wrap up.
Yeah, that was the second episode of the Natives Rouseabout podcast. Thank you all for listening. Obviously we're still getting into the hang of things, but I reckon it was a decent effort, and look forward to seeing you guys all next week.
Catch you, mate.
Yeah, beauty.
All right.